Welcome back to the shed. Today I want to take a look at the debut novel by Paolo Bacigalupi in The Windup Girl. When this novel came out, it won the Nebula and the Hugo for 2009 and 2010, and it actually shared the Hugo with China Reveals, The City and the City. So what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. We'll make some recommendations, I'll put it to the memory test, and we'll rank it on our ever-growing Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. So Paolo paints a pretty bleak view of the future. The novel is set in the 23rd century, and we find that Earth is devastated by rising seawaters due to global warming. We also learn that we've depleted all our natural resources in fossil fuels, and production of food is largely governed by these calorie companies. They've been gene splicing, as the book puts it. They've been genetically modifying food in a way that's also introduced a whole lot of new diseases and plagues and pests to go with it. And what we learn is that these calorie companies are really interested in what Thailand's got to offer, because Thailand saw this coming and have built a big moat around this city to protect them from the rising seawaters. But more importantly, they've also stored all the seeds of all the plants and all the produce that Earth had to offer in this seed bank. And what we find is that there's this guy from the calorie companies and a guy called Anderson. And Anderson runs this click spring factory. And the way I envision that, it's because they've run out of fossil fuels. They've got these big mechanical springs which have been compressed, and the energy they produce is measured in kilojoules, and it's sort of using inertia, I guess, where these bodies want to, release their energy. So Anderson is really running this click factory at a loss because that's not his ultimate aim. What he's really trying to do is get his hands on these seeds, right, out of this seed bank. He's got this guy called Honk Seng or something like that, I've forgotten the name temporarily, who is this Chinese refugee from a Malaysian ethnic cleansing, right? So he's a refugee, and he's come down from a pretty decent living, right? So he's seen his family slaughtered, he's seen his wealth completely ripped and stripped from him, and he's now playing servant to this Anderson guy. So he's got some pent-up resentment towards Anderson and people in general. And that's one of the things that's rather interesting in this novel, because all the characters seem to have only one thing in mind, which is their self-preservation. But I'll come back to that when I talk to my likes and dislikes. So what we've learned is that the world is governed by three distinct parties. One is the Environment Ministry, or the White Shirts. The other one is the Trade Ministry, and the other one is the Queen, or this very young Queen, but it's really just a figurehead for the Queen's region. And what we find is that these three parties are constantly at odds at each other, trying to get the one up on each other and constantly bickering and warring against each other. And what we learn is that the captain of the White Shirts, this guy called JD, is really trying to clamp down on some of the antics that the Trade Ministry's got going on. And there's a whole lot of feuding that happens there, which leads to some rather interesting outcomes for them. But Anderson, in the process of all of this, meets up with one of these wind-up girls in a sex club. And these wind-up or new people, as the book calls them, are genetically modified humans. They're a rather interesting sort of human that has really been an outcast. So the White Shirts want to pretty much obliterate them. And there's a lot of negative views from the public at large. But this wind-up girl has got a very particular part to play in the novel, which I don't want to talk to too much because it would sort of give the plot away. But needless to say, it's a wonderful piece of world building. We have these warring different parties, and in the midst of all of that, we had a wind-up girl who's this newly genetically modified human who's coming to learn to discover herself and her true potential, and all comes to a clash. So the question then is, what is Anderson's ultimate fate when it comes to this click spring factory? Will Hong Seng rebuild his life, and does he have a future there? What about the ultimate fate of the wind-up girl and her people? What will happen to them? And what is the outcome for the White Shirts and the Trade Ministry and the Ministry of Environment? So look, very, very interesting novel. So what did I like? Not to sound pessimist, but I really like the bleak view outlook that Paolo's given humanity in this novel. It is for me a very dark and not very hopeful scenario that is painted for us here. But that is one of the enjoyable things, right? It's not always this utopia that we're facing in the future. And I think this is very much a dystopian novel in that sense. So I did enjoy the world building as such as for what it is. I also enjoyed the characters, strangely enough, because the characters were all very much self-centered. They only really had one motivation, which was their self-preservation. But I did enjoy that. I did enjoy the interaction between the different characters. And I remember reading an interview online of Paolo's when he gave around this book. And he said that it was a very difficult book for him to write due to those characters always being self-centered and the bleak outlook on the future. So it is definitely that way. I don't know if it's a book I would want to read if my mind's not quite in its happy place, but it's definitely worthwhile reading just to get that alternate view of what the world may look like in the 21st century. The other thing I really enjoyed is the concept of the Windup Girl. I thought she had something to give. I really did enjoy the character of the Windup Girl. There are some terrible things that happened to her, but I think it's all well explained as to why she was submissive in the way she was, given her genetically demeanor and the training and what she was forced to do. So I do understand that, but I did like the concept of that. I think it could have been taken to the next level. So I don't think it was perfectly done, but I did really enjoy the concept of the Wind-Up Girl and the movements especially. I thought that was pretty cool. The other thing I really enjoyed is the writing. I've seen criticism online with Paolo's writing suggesting that he's pretty much what do you call it, a reporter, right? He's reporting the story as opposed to telling the story. But look, that may be true for some people's reading opinion, but it was definitely not the way I saw it. I remember reading the book, and a couple of times I was saying to myself, you know, this is a pretty well written book. I did lose myself in the writing. I found several times where I thought this is just really nice, really entertaining writing. So I did enjoy the writing. I know I've seen differing views online, but I really enjoyed the writing in Paolo Bacigalupi's Bacigalupi. I'm Italian and I still can't pronounce it. Bacigalupi's writing. So what is there not to like? Look, I said that I enjoyed that bleak view of the future, but there are people out there I suspect that will not find much joy reading a book that doesn't give much hope. So keep that in mind when reading it, but I didn't see that as a dislike. I actually like the fact that we're looking at this dystopian future where not everything is going to go to plan, right? But some of the things I found in there were some discrepancies, right? When we're talking about a world that is pretty much devastated, there was a section in the book that talks to this fruit, this Nor fruit, and there seems to be a whole lot of mystery around that. And not to give spoilers away, but read the book and you'll know exactly what I mean by, well, what was the point of the Nor and why was it there in the first place? It sort of left you hanging, I feel. Also, some of the things with those Cheshire cats, they had these cats which have been genetically modified that almost renders them invisible, right? And they almost seem to be passing through wars due to their well-given camouflage. But, you know, within the span of 20 years, they seem to have overtaken pretty much every cat on Earth, right? And every dog on Earth as well. There's not much talk of any other animal but these Cheshires. That sort of got me wondering, well, what are they feeding on apart from perhaps dead humans, right? I really don't know. Which the book does sort of suggest. But then on the other hand, you know, we've lost all our fossil fuels and everything's measured in calories. But we have these huge genetically modified elephant type creatures, megalodons, I think they were called. And I thought, yeah, great concept. You know, you got these big beasts of burden pulling, you know, large loads to generate calories or kilojoules. And I thought, cool, great concept. But then I thought, well, is that really what we would be doing? Because how are you going to feed these animals, right? Because, you know, there's a whole lot of food shortages. And all the crops, you know, are constantly getting bombarded with new pests and strains and diseases. And I just always thought to myself, well, how much do these megatons or whatever they're called, some kind of megatons, I think they were called, how much would they need to get fed? And will the calorie intake of that animal be matching the output. I don't know. Look, it's a minor criticism, but there were little things like that through the novel that I sort of thought, well, I'm not quite sure how believable this world view is, right? But look, not to take anything away from it, I was really clutching at straws, trying to find something that I could talk to as a negative, because I thoroughly did enjoy the book, right? But I would say that there were some discrepancies in the novel that I couldn't quite make sense of. But then again, it's science fiction, right? Not everything needs to make sense. So when it comes to the memory test, I read this novel, I think it would have been around about 2010 when it first came out, when it first hit the shelves. I remember reading it and China Miéville's book at the same time. And I do remember that bleak view of the future, right? And the cover sort of reminds me of that because, if you can see that, got that big megaton animal in the front and sort of grey, foreboding sort of look on the novel itself. So I did recall that aspect of the novel, and I did recall it was based in Asia somewhere. I couldn't necessarily remember it was Thailand, but I knew it was generally in that area, right? So I did remember, and that's one of, I think, the highlights for me is that, Paolo's obviously spent a fair bit of time in Southeast Asia, and he's got a good understanding of the culture, at least to a foreigner's point of view, right? He may be completely wrong, and I'd love for your comments if you're from Thailand and you've read this book, whether or not it truly depicts the culture adequately. But I look from an outsider looking in, I thought it gave you some insights into Thai culture and customs, which may be completely wrong, right? But I sort of read that on face value and thought, yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting aspect of the culture I wasn't aware of. But I'd love to hear your thoughts if you are from Thailand and you've read the novel. Yeah, so yes, I did remember that. I remember the setting. I remember the world, the bleak view of the future. But I couldn't remember much else of the plot. And maybe that is one of the negatives in the book as well. The plot is good. Look, I did enjoy the novel thoroughly. But I would say that the characters and the plot were just good, right? They weren't great. I just said just very good characters, very good plot, very good world building. But none of those three really stood out as a top-notch, yeah, this is a cream of the crop. So when it comes to recommendations, Time magazine suggests that Paolo Bacigalupi is a worthy successor to William Gibson. Now, I'm not going to argue that point, but definitely the recommendations there. If you like William Gibson and books like The Neuromancer, I think you will find something enjoyable in The Windup Girl as well. It is that dystopian future. It is that biopunk, cyberpunk type novel that is very interesting in many aspects. So I did thoroughly enjoy it. So we've got to make yet another hard decision and rank this on our Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. So how about I'll flip the cameras around and we'll do that just now. So back to the Shed Ladder and ranking today's Hugo and Nebula Award winning novel for 2009 in Paolo Bacigalupi's The Windup Girl. Now on the board we've got 3 columns going on, the top 15, the middle 15, and the best of the rest. Now, I don't think it's going to be on the bottom end of the scale, nor do I think it's going to be towards the top end of the scale. I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle. So just to go through my criteria again, I'm looking for how well developed are these characters? How well developed is the plot? How memorable is the plot? How strong are the fantasy or science fiction themes in this novel? And what about my overall enjoyment? Now, I think it has got some pretty strong science fiction concept. I did like that bleak view of the future. Very strange and sinister and hopeless scenario that is painting for us, right? So I did enjoy the world building, and I think the concept were quite strong. I don't think they were revolutionary in any way. Like, I think even in 2009 and 2010, there was a whole lot of anxiety around, fuel, depletion of fuels. I mean, that's been going on since the 40s and 50s, right? So there was nothing new in that sense. There was nothing really new around global warming and rising sea waters. There was nothing really new around genetically modifying food. But I did like the way he combined it all, right? So I'd say the fantasy and science fiction elements were good, but they're not necessarily strong. Which is, quite a contrast to what we get on the A side. Typically, what we find on the A side is they're wonderful characters, or they're just absolutely brilliant science fiction or fantasy themes, right? So I would say that it's in the middle there when it comes to the science fiction elements. And I would say the same about the characters. The characters were good, but there was nothing really extraordinary about those characters. And they were all very much driven by the same agenda, self-preservation. And there was very little else that motivated these individuals. All of which were interesting characters, but they didn't really bring anything new or exciting or revealing about humanity, right? So again, I thought they were good characters, but not great characters. The memory test was the same. It stood the test of time. I mean, I read it 10 odd years ago, so it wasn't that long ago. But I couldn't remember much of the plot, but I did remember the imagery, right? This bleak view of the future. So I'm going to have to say it's definitely sitting in the middle. So how about we go through some of these books and see where we're going to land? So I don't think it's going to be better than Ringworld or any of the other books on top of it, right? Because those themes, like we've talked about in the past with Ringworld, are just very strong science fiction themes, right? That extraordinary world, ring encompassing a star, and the engineering and the hard science behind that, making something like that a reality, I thought were just brilliant. It had some flaws when it comes to characters and character, but as a memorable book, as a concept, it's way stronger for me than it was for Windup Girl. The Chloride Auxiliator is just a very interesting and fascinating book that will have you wanting to read it several times over. And even though I haven't used that criteria in the past, that sort of does play a part in my overall enjoyment. So I'm going to have to say that some of the characters there with the unreliable narrator do provoke a sense of mystery and you wanting to reread just to unpick that mystery a little bit more. Which I think for the Windup Girl, it's definitely a book you'd want to read, but not necessarily one you may want to read again for another 10 years, right? As it was the case for me. The Demolished Man, I just really liked Alfred Besser's writing, and I really liked that reverse murder mystery novel. So I'm finding it difficult to put it above The Demolished Man. And then we got Fire Upon the Deep and Red Shirts. And I'm going to have to say that it is better than Red Shirts, right? So I'm going to whack Red Shirts down the tab. And let's just talk about this through, and we're going to say, is it better than Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge? Because that was also a very interesting novel, and one that we've just read recently. Had some really interesting concepts about artificial intelligence and the threat of artificial intelligence. Had some really interesting alien characters. And this is a difficult one. Where would you rank it? Because I'm sort of lost. But I think I'm going to give the slight tip to Vernor Vinge, A Fire Upon the Deep. So I'm going to give the tip to Vernor Vinge just slightly over The Windup Girl by Bacigalupi. And maybe it has got to do with that bleak view of the future, right? Maybe there's a part in me that is very much an optimist. And that is, I think, the reason tonight I'm going to rank A Fire Upon the Deep over The Windup Girl. Because even though The Fire Upon the Deep did talk to, catastrophes for coming in humanity's future, there was always that hint of hope. And I'd like to remain a positive and hopeful person. But look, it was very much a tie. I did enjoy both novels very much. So when it comes to the others on the list, yes, I think it is better than Red Shirts. Is it better for Flowers for Algernon? I really got to move Flowers for Algernon one of these days. But like I've explained many times in the past, I absolutely love this novel, but I don't really classify it as a science fiction novel. And that's one of the criteria I look at. How strong are the science fiction or fantasy themes, which has a very strong weighting. But take nothing away from Flowers for Algernon, because it's absolutely brilliant. Is it better than Rite of Passage? Again, it's a difficult one, but I'm going to say, yeah, it probably is. And it's better than The Uplift War and Startide Rising and Man Plus. Primarily because I did enjoy the writing. Hey, that's where it sits tonight in our Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. It was a difficult one, and I'm not even quite convinced. But hopefully you can make some recommendations and suggestions down below. Where would you have put it? It wasn't an easy one to rank. Thank you so much for your time. I've been Peter. This has been a hot and steamy Sci-Fi Shed. And I'll see you next time in the shed.